Hey, what's up? This is B Mesmerize, and I am here with a cloud tutorial. Woo! Okay, so I am obsessed with clouds. I love clouds so much, especially you ever notice the amount of clouds that are in the sky after it rains? Like if you haven't noticed this before, wherever you're at, after it rains the next day, take a look at the sky and see if there's just really big luscious clouds out. That's my favorite thing. Every time, like the day after it rains, I always check to see what the sky is like, because 9 times out of 10 there are going to be some luscious clouds, and I'm just like, yes, so happy. But anyway, I took this picture when I was out and just, hanging around. And like many people, especially artists, there's always an excuse to take a picture and then use it later for reference or just to study. I'm guilty of taking a bunch of pictures because of that and then not actually studying. But this time I actually made a study. So there was really beautiful clouds out this day, and I thought, hey, I like clouds, so might as well study this picture and, do clouds. And yeah. So this is a walkthrough of the clouds I did for that study. So I hope you learned something. Enjoy. I think the number one thing to think about when you're painting clouds is the light environment and time of day, what color the sky is, because those are going to be the biggest factors that influence what your clouds are going to be like. I just decided to do this tutorial with a daytime setting and have, I think, the average cloud that you would want to paint. But there's clouds in sunsets, clouds in the morning, clouds when it's raining, clouds even at nighttime, which I love too. Have you ever, sorry, I can go on about clouds all day. I'll save that for another time. But anyway, so when I started this, I decided to pick a very low saturated color that kind of went with the sky. So I picked the sky color, went over to the left, and then went up so the color was lighter. So basically, when you paint, you want to get your sky color, desaturate it, and then move it up so it's a little white. But whatever you do, do not start with white. Clouds are not white. Nothing is ever pure white when you're painting. Sometimes it might look like it, but trust me, it's not. So always try to start off with a very light, desaturated color. One golden rule, I think, with painting that really helps me personally is to build up your values. A ton of tutorials that I've watched, they always say to just build up, get your mid-tone down, go to the shadows, and then add highlights. Okay, now to get into the stats. So starting off, my brush is heavily textured and I actually have scatter turned on. And if you're not too familiar with Photoshop, it's a brush setting. So if you go into your brush settings, there are a ton of them, but you'll notice scatter. And basically what it does is it takes the shape of your brush and adds a little bit of space to it when you paint, if that makes sense. There's the actual spacing setting, but then there's also the scatter setting that makes it more random than the spacing setting. So clouds are heavily textured, but they're really soft and fluffy at the same time. So what I do to work with this is have a textured brush, and then right now my opacity is at 75%. So it's going back to what I was saying earlier where you want to build up. I build up the colors value and I also build up the opacity. So right now, textured brush, scatter turned on, opacity at 75%. Now I can't stress this enough, but if you want to learn how to paint anything, I beg you, I highly suggest it is a great idea to use a reference. Always study from reference first and then try to do it from imagination after you know the basic structure. That's at least what I like to do, because if you go and just look at a picture and then try to do something on your own, there's a high chance that it's just not going to be as good as if you sat down and studied the subject a couple of times and really figured out what's actually going on. So like what the shapes actually look like, what the texture actually looks like, and then try to apply it on your own and then come back and go back and forth. I think that art is a never-ending battle. Your studying never ends if you want to, really improve and become a professional. So you just got to keep going. At least that's what everyone else on YouTube has told me. So with that said, I'm getting the shape together first, just the basic shape of the cloud based off of my reference. So as you can see, the tops are really rounded, but there are a couple of sharp edges here and there. One thing I also want to note is the brush is a hard brush. I'm not using the soft brush because the soft brush can get a little dangerous. A lot of people think clouds are like really fluffy, so the brush has to be fluffy, but I think it's better to start off with a hard brush so you can get that contrast, and then for me the texture takes care of the fluffy part. So yeah, the shape of the clouds, the top really rounded, and then the bottom is usually flat, at least in this case. I'm going to let this run now, and then we'll get into the shadows. So now I'm getting into the shadows. If you didn't notice, I ended up picking the color from when I was laying down the midtone first. So one dangerous thing that a lot of people think when it comes to shadows is that shadows are just gray. But shadows, there is a lot going on in there. So if there's a lot of light and there's an intense color, then any object that's in that environment will pick up some of the color in its shadow. So with clouds, the sunlight is a very intense light, just in case you didn't know that. And then the sky itself has a ton of color. So this is why the clouds, they look like there's blue in it, because the shadows are picking up all that color and the light from the sun. So one reason why I chose low opacity was because, like I said, I want to build up the opacity, and also I'm able to pick colors and make everything more cohesive and look more natural. So I took a color that had a little bit of the sky blue in it and a little bit of the midtone that I picked, and then just started applying everywhere where I saw shadows based on the reference. With clouds, even though they're really light, they still have core shadows and they still have highlights. And one thing to always keep in mind is the direction of your light source. So here you can see the light is coming in from the right. So most of the larger shadows will be to the left. So I'm keeping that in mind while I'm looking at my reference and laying down the bigger shadows first. That's another good rule of thumb for painting that's been helping me, is to lay down the big shapes first, and then you can go in with the details as you go along. Now I'm starting to build in the shadows more. So after I add in the purple and a little more blue, I went in with gray. So with this gray, I took it from the purple blue color that I got when I was first adding the shadows, and then I just desaturated that even more and then went down a little bit on the value scale, because clouds are still white and they still have core shadows. So since the clouds are white, they do reflect a lot of the color, but the core color is also gray. So if that makes sense, if you have a white object, then its shadow color will be gray. And then when you take the environment into consideration, if there's any colors laying around, then that color will be reflected in the object or on the object, including its shadow. So one way to get natural clouds that I've found is to make sure that you include as much color as you can. Always consider the environment when you're painting, because it has a big factor into the object itself. So there's light that you need to consider, and that helps with the direction of the shadow and how much of the local color that you have. And local color is just basically the color of an object. So I mentioned a blue ball. The local color would be blue. Or if you look at grass, the local color is green. So light influences how much of the local color that you see, and then also how intense the shadows are, and then any objects that are surrounding the objects, their color also impacts the way the object or the subject looks. Hence why there is purple, blue, and also gray in the shadows for clouds. So I have to admit, I got a little stumped when I was thinking about how to explain why I added purple to the clouds. So I don't want to get too scientific with this, but from what I was able to dig up, the clouds gather up all of the light in the atmosphere, like the wavelengths of light, and that's why they're white. But as I said, with the shadow, the blue is reflected, and there's purple either because the blue is mixing with the red light from the sun, and the wavelengths are showing in the shadows for purple. I noticed there was some purple in the reference, so I wanted to make sure that I added it here. It's always good to add a little bit more color, unless you want a monochrome painting. If you can find any subtle colors in what you see, I think it adds a bit of punch to what you're painting. I also think it's a stylistic choice. I believe that style comes from what people see and what they want to see in their art. So I personally am a sucker for color. So if I can find any sort of purple or red or orange or whatever, and anything that I'm looking at, like if I'm looking at a blue ball and I see a hint of red or maybe some purple, I will try to fit that into my painting. So I saw the purple and I wanted to have that reflected in my study, so that's why I chose purple and added it in here. Okay, now that I have most of the shadows established, I get to go in with a blending brush. So to blend, I have a very textured brush. Nothing in particular. I don't know if anyone knows the artist Jonas Thoreau, but way back when DeviantArt was the main place to post your art, he actually posted a huge pack of brushes for Photoshop, and I think I'll have it in the description so you can go check that out for free. So I just picked a random brush from there and made sure the scattering was turned on, and the strength I believe for the blend was at 29%, and made sure I picked the blending tool for this. With clouds, you don't want to go overboard with the blending. I think the beauty of clouds is that there's a lot of subtle detail to it, and I tried to capture that by having some hard edges and just blending where it really, really needed it. I chose a textured brush, so the edges are already taking care of some of the blending for me and keeping the light, fluffy texture of the clouds. So when I go to blend, I'm just picking particular places that really need it and also just going off of my reference. So you can see here there's a hard edge I kept between this shadow and the highlight of the bump next to it, and here also there's some hard shadows that I decided to keep. And mostly with clouds, at least in this case, the bottom was more blended, and I kept the top part of the main cloud more hard, and any softness is just from the texture of the brush. There are some parts of the cloud off to the side that are a little more soft, so I decided to blend those out more just to give more emphasis on the cloud in the center, because if you want to have a focal point, one suggestion is to make sure you have a good mixture of hard and soft edges, and then to keep things out of focus, you want soft edges. So that's what I did here. And now it is time for my favorite part, the highlights. I think highlights bring everything together, but they're also really dangerous, kind of like the blending tool. One thing I learned from a YouTuber here by the name of Istabrak is that if you want to make something realistic, then you need to make sure that you get your shadows in order before you can go and add highlights. And then when you go to add highlights, you have to do it sparingly. So I think that's been helping me a lot with my painting, and I stuck to that the rule when I did this painting. So for this one, I just picked the midtone that I had. Then I brought it up a little and then brought it to the right so there was a little more saturation. And then I shifted the color a little bit in the direction of yellow to get some of the yellow from the sunlight. And then I picked the peaks around the clouds and added highlight to those based off of my reference. And here I am still working with the 50% opacity brush and just building up different parts that I think really need it. Because as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of subtleties in clouds, so with a highlight, you just want to be as sparing as you can and put the highlight where it counts. Okay, and that is the end of the walkthrough. I hope you enjoyed that. This wasn't meant to be a full step-by-step tutorial. I'm pretty sure I'll be making a cloud tutorial soon. But this was more to talk about my process and give you pointers on how to make your clouds more realistic in your digital painting. So I hope you were able to learn something from this. And with that, this has been Be Mesmerized, and remember to be mesmerized with wandering eyes. Peace.